Congratulations on your wedding. I tried to keep my tone light as I spoke. I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I was hoping for a moment of happiness. Despite everything, I couldn't help but think about how uncomfortable I was in my current situation. Can you leave quickly after leaving some cash? I tried to convey my wish for a quick exit. Being around someone who is disabled can be unpleasant. I was already aware of that. I've been a working adult for a few years now, but life took an unexpected turn after I got married. Shortly after tying the knot, I was involved in a terrible car accident that changed everything for me. The accident left me without the use of both my legs, which was a devastating blow. Even though I attend therapy every week to push myself to get better, I still require a wheelchair to get around. At first, I was told that I would have to use a wheelchair. I was completely overwhelmed. The shock hit me like a tidal wave, and I struggled to understand what that meant for the rest of my life. Thankfully, my wife, my in-laws, and other relatives have shown me so much sympathy and support during this trying time. Their care and understanding have been crucial in helping me stay positive and motivated during the challenging recuperation process. Since I work from home, I've adjusted to my new life by figuring out how to be comfortable in my wheelchair. The assistance I need has been graciously provided by my wife and her family. However, one person has made this journey extremely difficult. That individual is now a source of annoyance for Me.My brother-in-law is intelligent, popular with his classmates, and generally comes off as a decent young man. I remember meeting him for the first time at my wife's parents' place. My hopes that we would get along, especially during such a difficult time in my life, were quickly shattered when he learned about my injury and saw me in a wheelchair. His true character soon became apparent. He once remarked something that I felt was completely out of place. The worst part is that you're disabled. Don't make things difficult for our family. It was challenging for me to believe that someone could say such to me, especially right after my accident. A wave of anger swept over me. One evening, when my wife and I went to visit my in-laws, he found me alone. "Don't put this wheelchair here, please," he said in an inauthentic tone. "Leave it outside when you come into our house because it's in the way." To me, who was mentally worn out from the challenge of adjusting to my new life, his comments felt like a cruel insult. It was made worse by the fact that he said these things when we were alone. No one is around to witness his rudeness. It sounded like a clever scheme to make me appear bad while he thought no one was watching. Even though his behavior irritates me, I tried to push it aside, telling myself that he was merely worried about how I affected the family. But it didn't stop there. My brother-in-law's snark seemed to intensify after that exchange. Each time I saw him, I sensed his underlying scorn, and it wore me down. I became afraid of family gatherings because I knew I would have to put up with him and his hurtful remarks. Then, out of the blue, he declared his engagement. The spectrum of emotions swirling in my mind was only made worse by the fact that his impending bride was the daughter of the president of the company where he worked. It was strange how quickly things could change. One minute he was nasty and contemptuous, the next he was marrying a powerful person. I couldn't help but harbor a small grudge. Despite my personal views, we extended our blessings for his marriage. It made no difference who his fiancée was. Since she would soon be a part of the family, I wanted to show that I could provide for her. The wedding preparations were well underway when the invitation finally arrived. I marked the box for 10 visitors and sent it back with a mix of excitement and apprehension, feeling obligated to reply immediately. The wedding of my brother-in-law generated a lot of interest. With the big day approaching, everyone appeared to be buzzing with anticipation. The lavish wedding, which was set to happen in a famous hotel, mirrored the wealth and status of the bride's family. I couldn't help but feel uneasy in the middle of all the glamour, even though I knew a lot of money was being spent on this occasion. On the day that finally arrived, my wife and I left for the wedding venue as soon as we walked through the doors. Everything was so lavish that I was amazed. The decorations were stunning, and there was a sense of excitement. I hoped I would blend in as the well-dressed guests milled around. As we navigated the crowd, my wife announced that she needed to use the restroom. I decided to wait in a corner of the ceremony hall. searching for a comfortable spot to observe what's going on around me. The grandiose nature of the occasion left me both amazed and jealous. I wanted to be pleased for my brother-in-law, but my thoughts kept going back to my own issues and how different my life had become. I was sitting there lost in my thoughts. I heard a familiar voice behind me. I looked curiously to see who it was. The excitement of the day and my curiosity about the type of contact that was ahead made me uneasy. I braced myself since I knew that my brother-in-law's presence might either make today more enjoyable or make an already challenging scenario much more awkward. As my brother-in-law put it, marrying an ugly woman is the worst thing you can do. But I'm ready to put up with it because she's the boss's daughter and will marry into a wealthy family. That's the dream. If it means I can live the high life, I'll put up with marrying someone ugly, he said, and it hurt. But I remained silent while I considered the implications of what he had said. My brother-in-law and his buddies had been arguing over the bride in a nasty and unnecessary way. After a while, he left the gathering, and I went back to my wife, who was talking to her family. I considered telling her what I had just discovered, but I couldn't bring myself to spoil her joy on such a significant day. I didn't want to share the unpleasant things I had just heard with her, ruining her happiness over her brother's marriage. I knew my brother-in-law and in-laws were already gathered in the groom's waiting room, so I prepared myself and headed there. As I entered, greeting me with a smile, my brother-in-law congratulated me on your marriage. As I walked in, I whispered, "Thank you for coming," and sent my warmest regards. His response was so nice that I couldn't believe he had just been bad-mouthing the bride. He glanced around, then said, "I would like to talk to you alone for a little while." Following me down a deserted hallway, he continued, "You two can go to the waiting room and unwind with that." I followed suit. He was interested but cautious about his words. As soon as we disappeared from view, I noticed a shift in his face. "What brought you here?" "Having a family member with a disability is disgrace." He spoke coldly, repeating the contempt he had shown when discussing the bride. "Just go home when you've paid for the party. The bride's family finds it inconvenient that there is a disabled person present." He said something that shocked me. How could he say such things? I had come to congratulate him on his marriage in order to support my wife and her family. It was annoying to hear him discuss my presence as if I were a burden. Why should I be told this when I came to congratulate my brother-in-law? I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. The truth came out from deep within. I was also worried that my wheelchair could irritate others. My brother-in-law had hit a nerve, and for a moment I felt defeated. He continued to make fun of me. I realized that my only choice was to leave. "I'll provide my sisters with an appropriate explanation," I muttered. I looked away, my heart heavy, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his remarks wounded me, and he laughed at my predicament, a sound that sounded cruel and disrespectful. The road home seemed endless and alone. With every second that passed, the weight of his disdain grew. My phone rang as I was turning into the driveway. "Your wife is where?" She gave a call. I was sick and nervous, and there was terror in her voice. I immediately told her I was going home. She insisted that I return to the wedding, which showed how concerned she was. "You understand how difficult it is for everyone when someone has my impairment. Don't you?" Even though my voice was light, it sounded heavier than I had planned. I didn't want to burden my brother-in-law with the truth about his harsh comments. "Who said that to you?" she asked in a firmer tone. "Nobody said anything like that," I replied with a lie in my mouth. "I'll be the one to yell at anyone who does." Hearing her outraged made me feel strangely happy, as if she were offended by my pain. Her protective attitude gave me comfort, and I realized how lucky I was to have her in my life. After that discussion, I decided to go to the wedding once more. When I returned to the venue, I immediately ran into my wife. Her face lit up with relief as she ran up to me and gave me a firm hug. When I returned, my in-laws grinned broadly, obviously relieved to see me. "Why did you come back?" My brother-in-law yelled across the room as he saw I had returned. People with disabilities are annoying, as I mentioned. His hateful comments were like a knife piercing the air. My heart sank as he spoke, and I felt my rage building again. However, before I could reply, my wife stepped forward, flushed with anger. Darry's tone of voice. She snapped, her voice rough and unforgiving. You should feel ashamed. I could feel the tension in the air and see my brother-in-law's expression of surprise. Her shout seemed to surprise him for a time. The room became quiet as everyone's focus turned to the confrontation, and I could sense the mood alter. Would you have the audacity to regard him as less than you? My wife's joy lit up the room. His family doesn't approve of your comments. I felt my heart swell with gratitude for her defense, and a wave of warmth passed over me. It reminded us of our steadfast love for each other in spite of adversity. Despite his deep-seated anger, my brother-in-law dared not respond to my wife's boldness. Instead, he was my agape, standing there, grappling with her deep devotion. While I watched the action, I was grieved by the family's division and proud of my wife's unwavering support. My brother-in-law's disdain was making that wider. I understood that navigating our relationships in the future would be challenging with someone so poisonous in our lives. The rest of the event was characterized by an uneasy atmosphere. I could still feel my brother-in-law's anger hovering over my wife and me, even during our positive moments. Together, we talked to family members, laughed, and smiled to create a joyful bubble. Despite the nervousness, I tried to focus on the love that surrounds us. I told myself that I had a lot of help. As the occasion went on, I started reflecting on the complexities of familial connections. My brother-in-law's behavior made it clear that acceptance would not be straightforward just yet. I also felt empowered by my wife's tenacious defense of me. It proved that love could prevail even in the most difficult situations, and I was determined to keep my strength despite the criticism. As the evening wore on, more dancing and celebrating took place. I allowed myself to get swept up in the moment's exhilaration. I treasure the time I get to spend with my wife and family. Darkness, however, tainted my brother-in-law's words. I decided to accept the light that love brought into my life and to stop calling him derogatory names. My wife's yell drowned out the sound of a party. I was furious, but my brother-in-law just brushed her off with a smug smile. I felt a surge of anger and frustration. People with disabilities are not allowed to access this location. I'm annoyed by your presence, I replied in an effort to maintain some emotional control. I tried to correct my brother-in-law's disparaging remarks, but they continued. He joked about me without feeling guilty, as though he relished the spotlight. There was a great deal of tension in the air, and shortly a visitor heard my brother-in-law and wife arguing angrily. Startled by the ruckus unfolding in the ceremony hall, the bride and her father turned their heads to observe the disturbance and approached us with a troubled expression. "What's going on?" the father of the bride inquired as he searched for answers. But as usual, my brother-in-law continued to abuse us, completely disregarding the fact that we were surrounded by guests. I could feel my patience ebbing away. It was as if someone had flipped a switch inside of me. I was starting to find his behavior unpleasant. In a moment of realization, I pulled out my phone and began playing a previously stored recording. The worst thing you can do is to marry an ugly woman. I pressed play, making the words audible. But since she is the boss's daughter, I'll put up with it. As the reality of the situation set in, there were gases in the air. My brother-in-law and his companions, caught off guard, turned pale as the echo of their own comments echoed through the hall. He said, "What the hell is this recording made up?" with apparent irritation. He began to make excuses, which caused his confidence to evaporate, and he was now desperately attempting to collect himself. Despite his desperate pleas to stop the tape, I continued to broadcast it for everyone to hear. The voice boomed, "I'm going to be the celebrity now, like I'm going to be rich." When my brother-in-law realized the consequences of his prior confidence, his cheeks went a deep shade of crimson, and his hands began to shake. His remarks weighed heavily on the audience, who muttered in astonishment. I would be willing to marry an ugly woman if it meant having a lot of money and being able to fool around for the rest of my life. The sound of the guests' laughter continued, evolving into a mixture of surprise and outrage. My brother-in-law's expression shifted from one of anger to one of fear upon realizing the overwhelming evidence against him. Malagape, he stood there, unable to think of a rational response. He had no idea that an earlier conversation he had had with his friends had been captured on tape. Before the ceremony began, they had discussed their plans without even being aware that their words were being recorded. The atmosphere in the hall changed dramatically as the visitors' astonishment turned to contempt, and they began muttering to one another. Someone grabbed my brother-in-law's arm and restrained him just as he was ready to strike me. The bride's father was taking a dominant stance, his expression somber. Enough. His words cut through the tension. Mr. President, I apologize for this situation. He spoke to me before turning back to my brother-in-law, but you have to understand how serious what you said was. My brother-in-law began to make excuses after realizing he had gone too far. This crippled person is a phony who is trying to set me up, he added, attempting to shift the blame onto me. It's all his fault. The bride's father responded quietly but firmly after listening to my brother-in-law's passionate charges, and his attempt to place the blame elsewhere only served to increase the wrath in the room. In a cool but forceful voice, he said, "You should know that my late wife was born with a disability. She lived her entire life in a wheelchair, and I dedicated my life to creating a business that would enable people with physical disabilities to work effectively. Your way of thinking is not appropriate for my place of employment." The weight of his comments hung in the air, making my brother-in-law nervous. It's not my fault. It's all his fault. He raised his voice in protest when he realized that the tide was turning against him. He made an effort to reconcile with the bride's father, but his explanations fell short. The bride, who'd been standing beside her father in silence, looked up. She looked at my brother-in-law in disbelief as she took in the fact that her groom had so casually spoken negatively of her. She said firmly, "It's unbelievable that you would say such things, especially about me. I'll call off the wedding and our engagement." There was no opportunity for compromise because of how uncompromising her tone was. The expression on my brother-in-law's face twisted in terror. "Wait, let's talk about this." His voice grew desperate as he pleaded, but the bride's father firmly blocked his path by moving ahead of him. The air was tinged with fury and disbelief. As the bride's vows were firmly established, she addressed the guests. "I truly apologize to each and every one of you for what transpired today," she said firmly. "This is not how I envisioned my wedding day. Because of the current circumstances, we had to cancel the ceremony." As they answered, the crowd felt a surge of sympathy and understanding. A murmur of agreement was heard, nodding in approval of the bride's selection. As I absorbed the spectacle before me, my heart raced. My brother-in-law's arrogance was the cause of this public humiliation, which was well earned following the bride's announcement. My brother-in-law became really agitated. He stood still, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. The pandemonium in the ceremony hall reached a crescendo as guests began to leave, some of them gazing at him disapprovingly. As they exchanged glances, the bride and her father came to a hidden understanding. They both decided they had had enough of his arrogance and disdain as they turned to address the other guests. A rush of vindication washed over me. The truth had come to light, and justice was being served, but not in the manner I had anticipated. My wife was standing next to me, and I glanced at her. Exhibit a mix of pride and concern. Her voice was sympathetic as she said, "I am so sorry you had to witness that." I took her hand and squeezed it lightly. "You don't need to apologize for anything." Overwhelmed by her unwavering support, I replied, "You stood up for what was right." As the last guests began to leave the auditorium, the chaos began to subside, and there was a nervous silence. The bride and her father departed together, side by side, determined to leave my brother-in-law behind, even though he was still enraged. As I reflected on the events of that day, I realized that the bride was all by herself. I realized that sometimes there are costs associated with speaking out against disrespect and brutality, but in that specific case, the cost was deserved. I came to see that love and support can triumph over even the harshest judgments. I felt more at ease and hopeful about the future after learning this. That I wouldn't have to put up with my brother-in-law's hate speech ever again with my wife's help. We would cooperate to get beyond any potential challenges. Despite our love and respect for one another, my brother-in-law fell and never got back up. The shock of the day's events had worn him down, and he was clearly overwhelmed by the consequences of his actions. Several customers gave him and his friends cold looks as they left the gathering. They showed a mix of incredulity and contempt. Some of them weren't scared to voice their genuine displeasure at his hurtful remarks. In the midst of the chaos, the bride stood up to declare her position. In exchange for breaking off the engagement, I want cash. She said it in an unflinching voice. She had every right to make it, even though it was a bold move. After the engagement and wedding were officially canceled, the bride's family informed everyone about the wedding costs and everything my brother-in-law had said. Up until now, the consequences of the day had gone beyond my brother-in-law's ego crumbling. He'd also insulted a prominent member of the community. My brother-in-law's activities were especially noteworthy because the bride's father was well known and well respected. There was a stir in the local business world after he was fired from the bride's father's company. Word quickly got out, and soon no other company wanted to hire him. They were afraid of the consequences because the bride's father had made it clear he would not tolerate such behavior from family members. My brother-in-law turned to his old friends in a desperate bid to obtain employment, but they progressively cut off their ties with him. After failing to find work, he decided to leave town altogether since he felt so lonely. He took on several distant jobs that forced him to work day and night in order to pay for the engagement and the wedding expenses. Ironically, while he was attempting to escape the repercussions of his actions, fate stepped in and had an unpleasant turn in store for him. He was also crippled in a manner similar to the one he had ridiculed as a result of a vehicle accident. My journey took a new turn for me. Thanks to my wife's unwavering support and my dedication to a tough recovery program. At this point, I was able to stand by myself. Each step felt like a victory, proving our strength as a team. Going shopping with my wife was my favorite weekend activity. It was my attempt to compensate for the burden I had unintentionally placed on her during those trying times. Finally, I learned that perseverance comes from love and that conquering adversity may lead to incredible connection and personal growth. Thank you for sticking with it through to the end. As we continue our journey, we are more resilient than before.